It gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, and that's Leontine Tolbaum, to give the first presentation of the day. So the idea for a guide to computational access really came from Leontine when she approached us with her thoughts probably about a year ago now. And she's really why we're all here today. We wouldn't have got very far with writing a guide to computational access and organising this event without the benefit of her knowledge and experience on the topic. So Leontine is really just going to start us off with an introduction to computational access. Over to you, Leontine.
Can everyone see that okay?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so hello everyone, I'm Leontine, as Jenny just said. Just for anyone who doesn't know me, I'm currently finishing up my PhD in a collaborative project with University College London and the National Archives, which is looking at access to born digital materials. So yeah, this is like very relevant. And I also work on the Archive of Tomorrow project as a web archivist based at the Cambridge University Libraries. So today I will be giving an introduction into computational access, and it's split into basically two parts. So first off, I will talk a little bit about the history of like digital repositories and like their online presence and how they've been providing access. And then I will go into computational access itself. So to start off, I thought it would be really interesting to show like an evolution of digital repositories on the web. And by the web, I mean basically the online public space, which is accessible by users. So just something to point out here that I find very fascinating as well is that digital repositories have not preserved their own history. So I had to consult some parts of literature, but also the internet and the UK Web Archive have been like saviors in this, which is quite funny. So to start off, the first early examples of the presence of digital repositories on the web is basically seen as a way of promoting the repositories themselves. So this is an example of the medieval illuminated manuscripts. So this was just a website that basically promoted works. So you had to physically go into the reading rooms to actually look at these manuscripts. And not all of them were found online, but like a small selection of them was made. And it was basically seen as a way of like, hey, look at all the cool stuff that we have. So that's really cool. But then it kind of moved into full catalogs being made available online. So these are just a few of like the early examples. And as you can see, they're from like the same type of period as like the promotional materials that were made available. And these are slightly different than the previous example in the sense that you could actually see most of the material that archives or repositories held. You could search them, you could look up, as you can see, there's like different types of keywords that you could use, but still it was that you could look stuff up, but you would have to go into the physical reading room to go and see the material, which was completely understandable at the time because digital material wasn't really around at that time. However, from like the mid-2000s, there's like kind of like a shift that starts to happen, which a lot of people within the literature call the digital shift. So this is basically the point where catalogs are still being used, and they're still being used today. But basically, it was not only to just consult material that you may be looking at in a physical reading room, but also you could actually see that material within the online space. There's a number of reasons why this digital shift happened, why there was like more of a seeing this material as its own entity and not just seeing it as an additional thing that had to be done. First off, it was because a lot more material was being digitized. So there were huge, massive digitization projects in the early 2000s and 2010s that basically meant that a lot of material was digitally. And a lot of repositories made the choice to not only, have it available in the reading rooms, but have it available online as well. Born digital material is a big one here. So basically, the only way to see that material is digitally, like there's no physical copy of it. But two other things that have like started playing a bigger role in the last few, like 5 to 10 years, is that computing capacity is something that is finally up to a speed where it can be used to see this material in a different approach. And there's been a lot of tools and examples that are being made available. And by this approach, I basically mean seeing this material as not as a physical entity or like its own little thing, or viewing it the same way as like you would view a paper record, but actually seeing it as its own thing, like as data. A really good example of a project that was highly influential in like the whole computational access guide is the Collections as Data project. If you've not heard of it, the report is like, highly recommend reading the report on that, but it's a good example of like seeing this material in a different light. So that moves us on to what computational access actually is. So basically what it is any type of access that requires computational methods. So thinking of this is basically kind of making this material available as data. But it goes, so when I say that, a lot of people will think about AI or machine learning or those types of methods, like the state-of-the-art stuff, basically. But that's not all that computational methods is. Like, for example, if you were to summarize something within a spreadsheet, that would be considered computational, because you still need access to a large amount of data or large part of the collection to actually run those types of methods. So it's certainly not limited to those state-of-the-art projects. Also, it should be available in the digital environment or that online public space that I was just mentioning, and it should be scalable. And by scalable, I mean, so it's not about like, I don't know if any of you have had this experience, but it's not about putting a whole bunch of data on a hard drive and sending it to a researcher. It's more about coming up with an infrastructure that is that makes it possible for more people to do this. So yeah, and if granted by copyright laws or other regulations, it should be accessible to all. I will come back to some of the examples which make restricted data available in a sec, because the thing that I will be talking about now is like the different approaches that you can take to computational access. So you can roughly split it into 4 approaches. So terms of use, bulk data set, API, and platform. I will talk about those in a bit of a detail in a minute, and then some examples. So yeah, 4 different approaches. And what I also wanted to say here is it's not as if one approach is better than the other. It depends on like a lot of stuff. So as I was saying, like legislation plays a big role here. So if you've got restricted access, one may work better than the other. And yeah, it depends on your data as well, or your collections. So to start off with the terms of use, this one's like slightly different than the other one. So this is not necessarily where people have made the material available as data, but organizations that may hold or may make data available, or not data, like material available for a catalog, are like making it accessible to users, may think of you using a terms or implementing a terms of use, or it could also be for repositories that are giving out like computational access. But basically what it is that you have some like kind of rules set up for people who want to use your material. So as I was saying, you don't necessarily have to have computational access in place to have a terms of use. So if you have a catalog and are making anything accessible to users, it's still handy to have this. This is specifically thinking about stuff like web scraping. So some people may start like web scraping material that's available online, which in some cases is fine, but it is good to have like some type of like rule set up for that, like being like, don't do it, or if you do it when not everyone's trying to access or catalog. That type of thing will show up on these types of terms of use. But also, as you can see in the title of this one, privacy and copyright policies will also be listed. It's kind of like to make users aware of like what you can and cannot do with this material. The bulk data set is the first one where you do make material available to your users. And this is through a data set. So just as a little model to showcase it, you would have like the digital preservation practitioner or the organization will make a self-contained data set, which they then make available through some type of interface or portal. And then the user will download this and do their own computational methods over it. And this means that there is quite a bit of like time put into setting up that data set, because that has to be done by the organization, and that the user downloads the whole data set, even if they only want to use part of it. A few examples of this are one from the Hathi Trust here, which is their extracted feature data sets, which you can download. So you download the whole data set and then do whatever you want with it. Another one being the International Social History Institute, which has a bunch of data sets available. And interesting enough of them as well to point out here is that they host, or they use an open tool called Data First to make this possible. So they've implemented the infrastructure, but not built it all themselves, which is interesting because it showcases that you don't need to have everything in-house to make it possible. And another example of that is MoMA, which have do not only use a different infrastructure, but also host it on a different website, which is GitHub. And they basically just update a data set, and that's where people can download it from. So it's interesting to see that you don't necessarily have to host or keep that infrastructure in-house yourself. There's like a bunch of tools and a bunch of like examples of people trying it in a different way, which is really cool. Okay, so the third approach is an API, which is an application programming interface. And what that basically, I'm going to explain it a little bit very fast here, but it's like explained in detail in the guide as well. But basically what it comes down to is that there's like a data store. Normally this is some type of database, and the user is able to request data from it through like, again, some type of portal or interface. So in this one, the user will normally request data that they want. So it's not a full data set that's like set up. And also from the repository side, you don't have to download, or you don't have to like prepare specific data sets in place, because like there's a database that is running it that will update. So you can imagine with these data sets, sometimes after a certain amount of time, they will be out of date. Which would not be the case with an API, because that's like live data that's then requested. Just to give a few examples of this again, this is the API that is run by the Wellcome Trust. As you can see, they also have like different ways into it. Something that is interesting to point out here, if you actually look into a lot of APIs, they're very focused on being available for developers, which is quite interesting there as well. Another example of an API is the one, I never know if you pronounce it that way or not, but there was Wasabi, but it's the Web Archiving Systems API, and that's another example of an API that's like used within our field. And the last one is a platform. So a platform gets used in a lot of cases by institutions that have restricted data or some type of copyright with their data, are want to be offering their users something on top of just the data. So again, just as a schema, just to show here, you would have data, which is then made available on the platform or the interface, which the user can get into that platform or interface and manipulate that data. And depending on the restrictions on the data, sometimes the users can download what they've like done with it. So if they've like run some type of query or something on that material, sometimes they can take it away and do their own research on it as well, but that's not always the case. Just to point out a few again here, the HashiTrust has data capsules. So you come into like a setup environment, they set up an environment for you where you can then run your tools and your algorithms on their material. And they check it, and then you can take it away. But I think it also depends on the material that you're running it on. And another example of that is the Claria Media Suite. And this one, on top of like offering a platform where you could run your own tools on, they actually offer the researcher tools themselves as well to play around in. So that's like a fully set up platform to play around with some material, which is really cool. So I'm quickly going to touch upon this, but like Jenny's going to go into a lot more detail on this, but there was just a few things that I wanted to point out here. So yes, we've made a computational access guide, and the main reasons for that I've listed here on this slide. But basically it comes down to, there's a lot of resources out there, right? Like not necessarily computational access, but like making your collections available as data, or like doing something more computational methods related to the material. But a lot of it's always like catered towards users, not necessarily towards the digital preservation practitioners that are making it available. So that always seemed to be a bit messy. And also, if there was stuff available, it's a lot of it's like changing people into like savvy data scientists, which is cool and like really useful if you have more, like if you're able to upskill and have more computational skills. But we also realized that it's like a lot of it's like more about empowering digital preservation practitioners. So it's more about being familiar with the terms and being able to talk to, for example, IT within an institution about this type of stuff, or those types of queries more. And also there's a lot of, and Jenny mentioned this when we were doing the Mentimeter, there's a lot of like related terms to computational access, and they're used, but they're used interminglingly, and they're like, not everyone's sure what everything means. So we also thought it would be really useful to have like these definitions, but also put them within the context of our work. Like if there's examples from our field, to link those up with each other. So that's why we wanted to make the guide. I don't know if we're going to do questions now, but if you do have any questions or want to get into contact with me for any other stuff, these are my contact details. So yeah, that's me.
Great, thanks, Leontine. And we do have time for questions now, if anybody has any, but perhaps we've also got time for a round of applause if anyone wants to find the non-verbal reactions. So that was a great introduction. And I should say much of the information shared in that presentation, particularly around those 4 different approaches to computational access, is actually in the guide. So once we launch that in about 9 minutes time, you'll be able to read that off yourself. So does anyone have any questions for Leontine? Just lots of applause and praise. I had a question just around those 4 approaches, and I was wondering, you know, we're talking about barriers for people getting started. Sometimes it's easier to say to someone, there's one approach, there's just one approach, just do that, rather than, oh, there's 4 approaches and you have to choose between them. I was just wondering how people would choose, and whether there's one that's considered like better practice than the others, perhaps, or if they're all on a kind of a level.
If you ask technical people, they will say API for sure, because like it's seen at the moment as like a sustainable way. An API is quite fascinating in the sense that it can be your own infrastructure, but then also the infrastructure that provides access. But if you were to think of it from like a practical point of view, I think a data set's like a really good way to get started because it like gets an idea of like, okay, what would our material look like as data? Like what type of documentation do we need to provide with that? And those types of questions. So it makes you think about like, okay, yeah, okay, it's data now, like what comes with it? So again, it really depends on what type of institution you are, because then platforms are really good for people who have restricted data and do not have the opportunity to even think about APIs or data sets and just letting their data out in the wild. So it depends.
It always depends. Good answer. Thanks, Leontine. So, William, you've got your hand up. Have you got a question?
Yeah, maybe it's a version of the same question, Leontine. I'm going to come at this from a user perspective. Okay, so you've got different models. Now, my experience as a user, okay, is trying to use APIs or trying to use kind of well-devised interfaces and ultimately feeling a bit frustrated because whatever it is that I want to do is exactly not what the designers have imagined, and therefore going ultimately to the data, asking for the raw data, and actually having a bit of a nightmare trying to make sense of the raw data. But at a fundamental level, as a researcher, that process of understanding the data actually being something which I couldn't really delegate in any case. It's just something I had to do. Now that's my experience, but I'm curious as to know if there's good practice in establishing user needs in order to answer, you know, you've got your 4 models there. Is there any way to establish which is the best based on user feedback? And this might not be for you, this might be for everyone on the call, by the way, just for the record.
I know that, so I'm going to say I don't really necessarily know how to answer that one, because again, I think it really depends on who your users are. What I am going to say about user needs within like Born Digital work, like having this material as data, is that a lot of users will just turn around and say, well, you tell me what to do because I don't know, which is also just fascinating. But I know the Claria project has done a lot of like additional user research, which is very interesting to read on top of like just their platform and stuff. Because like you say, like they set up specific methods and tools, but then no one's using it because that's not what the researchers want. So yeah, it's interesting. It's something that we should explore. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm glad you brought up user needs so early on, William, and I think that's something we'll come back to perhaps in the discussion at the end. And I should have said at the start, obviously, if you have a question, you can pop that in the chat box, or you can put your hand up and speak if you would like to do that. So, Michael, you've got your hand up.
Hi, I just want to second actually what you were saying about the chat. I'm keeping an eye on it, and if there are questions, I see one's just coming from Ruth. I think we may be able to pick that one up. But my question was kind of the other end of William's, which is, does opening up a collection or a data set to computational access kind of always necessarily lead to increased IT security risks? Because I know that's one of the obstacles I encountered when trying to open up collections. The IT people say, oh no, we can't let people in, we can't let people run stuff on our. And are there some approaches that are more robust than others, or more likely to persuade an IT department to go down the opening up collections route?
I'm going to say something really annoying here and say it probably depends on the collections that are going to be made available, if that makes sense. I think by having, as we've like been collecting a lot of like case studies in different ways of like why it would be beneficial to do this, I think that could be a really interesting starting point to like discuss with IT, to be like, look, it's not all doom and gloom. There can actually be really good and beneficial things around this, because I do think that IT sometimes, and that's good because there are security risks around doing this, making it available at scale. They do sometimes forget that there's also benefits from doing this. So yeah, I think that's a really important point of the guide as well, that we're trying to like give people the vocabulary to start that discussion with IT and be like, instead of just being like, oh yeah, that's not possible, and then digital preservation practitioners being like, okay, bye. But instead of that, turning around and actually being like, no, but actually it would be beneficial to us. So yeah, I think there are a few practical steps that we have in the guide, right, Jenny, for around security. Yeah, so hopefully
Thanks.
that answers your question.
Sure, I suspect it may crop up later on, but we'll keep going.
There's something in the chat from Thomas as well about working with users, and he shared an example of partnering with users on committees, advisory groups. That sounds like a great model to follow, Thomas. It'd be good to find out more about that. But there's a link there to follow if anyone's interested. So there's a question from Emma Hancox saying, are there particular types of collections that are particularly suited to computational access? That's a great question, Emma.
I think collections that are already digital is already a good one. Normally, the data sets that I showcased at the start are, some of them are actually only metadata, which is also interesting. So it's not even the material itself, it's only the metadata that's with that material. So it seems to be stuff that's already digital, stuff that's well documented, and stuff that's quite, but then that really ties in with documented, like that is quite familiar. So it's not like a black void of stuff and they're like, oh, we can just change that into a data set. So yeah, well documented digital stuff, I would say.
So often when you hear about case studies using computational access, it's quite often web archives that you see being used as a case study. So I did have a similar thought to Emma about, are there particular types of data that are better suited to this? And is there a reason that people seem to be often using web archives? They must fit quite neatly into the model, I would guess. Or maybe that's just the things that I happen to have seen most of, but it's not really a true pattern. I don't know.
No, I think web archives always get like that type of thing because they're normally, some part of them is openly accessible, and on top of that, they're an interesting born digital one. So people are always like, yeah, let's play around with web archives. But and also quite generic file formats are quite common. So like CSV, TXT, that type of stuff, you would see a lot of. Yeah, machine readable stuff, as Abigail's saying. Yes.
Great, thanks for that, Abigail. And it's good to hear about your experiences of working with users or finding out what users actually want as well. That's really helpful. Okay.